So hi guys. So this is the second last panel of the weekend. So this is the 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock panel, and we have got the lovely Allan Martin, and we've got the equally lovely Lesley Kelly. So this is the one called, is it Writing Kind Stories Set in Scotland. So first of all, we've got Allan Martin has had a career as a teacher trainer and lecturer, and beginning writing fiction after taking early retirement. His first novel, The Peat Dead, published by Thunderpoint, was shortlisted for the McIlvanney Debut Prize in 2019. The Peat Dead, set on the island of Islay, introduced Inspector Angus Blue, based in Oban, and his associates. The second Angus Blue novel, The Dead of Jura, set on Isley's neighbour island, was published in 2020, and the third Angus Blue novel, A Murder in Appin, will appear later this year. Meanwhile, Allan has begun a second series set in 1930s Estonia, Death in Tallinn, set in 1933, introduces Chief Inspector Juri Halmets. Allan also writes short stories. I'm saying the names wrong, just please construct me. For I Scott magazine, and has translated a 1937 crime novel from Estonia, which sounds so amazing, and something I think we all want to probe Allan on about. And then we've got Lesley Kelly. She's the author of the Health of Strangers novels, a crime fiction series set in a parallel Edinburgh, beset by a killer virus, which sounds pretty.
No longer parallel, is it?
It's not. No, it's like living. She also wrote a standalone novel, Fine House Trinity, which was longlisted for the McIlvanney Award in 2016. So we've got two McIlvanney nominees here with us. So Lesley's Health of Strangers books, if I got this right. So first of all, we started with The Health of Strangers, then it was Songs by Dead Girls, then it was Murder, no it wasn't, it was Death at the Plague Museum, then it was Murder at the Music Factory, which was released last year, and then there was a short story on Amazon, and I think it's still Amazon, an Amazon freebie. So you've got a Kindle and an ebook. It's called The Art of Being Dead, and it's also in the Health of Strangers series. And then we had A Fine House in Trinity, which was the first book that introduced me to Lesley. So I've had the pleasure of interviewing both Lesley and Allan and meeting them for my blog There's Been a Murder. So we're gonna stay away kind of from like the set answering questions, because obviously I've done that with Allan, Lesley before, and I can put up a link to the blog if anybody wants to read it. But we're just going to talk about the latest books about Allan's Estonian novels. I mean, Lesley, it's not a parallel anymore, like the pandemic type thing. So if you guys have questions, leave it in if you're on YouTube, leave it in the comments bit, and we'll get to them later on. So I'm just going to start with asking Allan a bit of a question about his Estonia novels, because that's far cry from like the Angus Blue, which are obviously set in Oban and the island. So I think we're just going to start with Allan's Estonia one. How did that come about?
Well, we visit Estonia very often, at least every year. Well, at least that was until last year. And having written the Peat Dead and the Dead of Jura, I just felt that something different was worth doing. I've been very interested in Estonian history. I used to be a history teacher. I was very interested in Estonia's history, particularly as it's a small country which fought very hard for its independence from the Russian Empire, and was then in 1940 swallowed up again by the Russians, and only got their independence in 1990. So it was an interesting country to look at, a small country during the 1930s, sandwiched between two very, very large and aggressive and greedy neighbors. So that's how it came about. I did quite a lot of research, which included learning Estonian. I can't actually carry out a conversation in it, because as soon as you open your mouth and say a word, somebody will come back, and I haven't a clue, okay? By the time I've looked up the second word in the dictionary, they've moved on to the next paragraph. So I can work through reading stuff, but and that's how I translated the other book. But speaking is going to take a lot longer and a bit more immersion. But the books were an attempt to sort of look at how a policeman would deal with a crime that has a political aspect, because it's the same in the Pete Dead and the Dead of Jura. There's a political aspect as well as a police procedural aspect. And I wanted to take that to a different environment and a more interesting, a different historical environment. And that enables you to bring in the rise of the Nazis and what's going on in Russia. And in the next book, for instance, the second book in the series, it involves a visit to Finland, where we look at the rise of the fascist movement in Finland. You know, all sorts of interesting stuff going on, which nobody here knows about. So it was actually very interesting to write, because it enabled me to do an awful lot of very interesting research, visiting the sites where everything happens, and then putting the stuff down and then showing it to my Estonian friends to see how they would react. And I got a lot of good feedback from people that I know in Estonia and during our visits. And I have to say there is a possibility that it even might be published in Estonian. I know that the Pete Dead has been published in Estonian. I can hopefully point to there it is, there's the cover, Turba Surnud.
Wow.
So who knows, if Death in Tallinn gets published in Estonian, that would be fantastic. So it was really enjoyable, both to research and to write. The trickiest bit was, as usual for me, is reducing the first draft from 150,000 words to about 95, 100. So there you go.
Can I ask a question, Alan? How difficult is Estonian? Because it's not got any similarities really at all to English or French or German or...
It's very difficult. Yes, it's very difficult because you're right. It's a completely different language. There are 14 different endings to words so it's worse than Latin or German in that respect. There are 14 different endings that tell you what's going on in the word, as it were. There are one or two. The main thing is you look at it and there's nothing you recognize. If you look at French or German, you start seeing words international words and so on that you're familiar with. With Estonian, that's not the case. There's a few German loan words because Estonia was ruled by German aristocracy for about 600 years. So there's quite a lot of German loan words. But the only language it's similar to is Finnish, which actually Finnish looks even worse than Estonian, I have to say. I did try and learn a bit of Finnish on Duolingo, but I gave up because it was actually too confusing with the Estonian, because it's like similar but different. And the orthography, the way the words are laid out is rather different, because it was developed by Swedish grammarians, whereas Estonian was developed by German grammarians. So very interesting to learn. I spent 3 online years with Tartu University and a fantastic tutor, Marika Terau, who helped me enormously. So yeah, it's interesting.
I went on holiday to the Baltic states years and years ago. It'd be like in the 1990s, I think, and we went interrailing. So we went to Estonia and Finland and Latvia and Lithuania. And I'd very foolishly, kind of, British-centric view of the world, assumed that they'd all be quite similar, and then got there and found out really, really different. Language is really different, culture really different, influences, some of them much more Russian than others. And when we were there, they were even on different times. Their clocks had gone back at different hours, so they were working on different time zones.
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 hours difference between us and Tallinn, for instance, at the moment. So, although thankfully Estonian summertime begins the same weekend that British does, so that's something. But yeah, Tallinn is a very beautiful city, all sorts of interesting things to see. And we've also been around the country as well, right, the various different cities and places. We even managed to drive through Russia while we were there. because there is in the south
Leningrad.
east of Estonia, there's a little nodule of Russia that sticks into Estonia, and you drive along in your hired car along, and suddenly you get to this sign that says, "Do not get out of your car. Stay in your car. Do not stop." And then suddenly the road is unsurfaced, the beautifully surfaced tarmac, and suddenly there's stones. And you go along, and it's just woods, trees on either side, and you think, are there Russian soldiers in there peeping out, looking out with their binoculars? And then you get to the other end, and then there's, "Welcome back to Estonia," and the road starts again, and off you go. And it's really curious.
Were you there before, while it was still a Soviet Union country, or you'll never been there after Glasgow?
No, we didn't go before. I must admit, we have experienced Soviet life because we did go to East Germany a few times before the fall of the wall, and that was a very interesting experience. And I know that from talking to Estonian friends that that Estonia was very similar to that, because it was part of Russia and only became free at the end when the Soviet Union collapsed and Boris Yeltsin kind of cut all the others loose and said, "Off you go, guys." So there actually is a big plaque to Boris Yeltsin on one of the walls in Tallinn, which says, "Many thanks, Boris. You set us free," that's quite nice, because there is a sort of tension in Estonia still between the Russian-speaking population and the majority Estonian population, which you sense when you're there. That all the taxi drivers, for instance, are Russian speakers, and most of the shop assistants and people you tend to meet in the towns. Whereas as soon as you get out into the countryside, by and large, everybody is Estonian. So that's another interesting dynamic, because the Russians population, many of them have got what they call a grey card, which is an Estonian ID card, which allows you to travel throughout the EU, but it also, because it's recognized by the Russians, it enables you to travel into Russia without any problems either. So many of the Estonian Russians have these grey cards that enable them to move freely between the EU and Russia. Get the best of both worlds, I suppose. They don't show a lot of keenness to be reunited with Russia, I have to say.
I don't blame them. So we have got a question, and is there any parallels between Estonian and Scottish history?
Oh no, that's in many ways no, because as I said, Estonia was for 600 years since the arrival of the what became the Teutonic Knights. These guys moved in the 12th, 13th century and sort of defeated the tribes and took over the land and made themselves the sort of lords and masters. But while you had this German aristocracy, nevertheless you had a subject population who were Estonians. Now maybe that's slightly the same as Scotland, where the land, in fact, the land is owned by people who don't work it, and who have maybe a similar disregard, or have had in the past, for the people who lived there. So there are certain similarities, but the big advantage Scotland had is that it was an independent state from about the 9th century, when it was Alba, right up to 1707, when it was sold for English gold, as they say. So there are some, but I mean, the other similarity is that, of course, Scotland, like Estonia, has an elephant in the room. In other words, Estonia has Russia sitting next door, Scotland has England sitting next door. So there is a certain amount of similarity. And when I was looking at the sort of political side of things, I think very often political things begin to look very similar no matter where you are. You know, there's corruption everywhere, shall we say. So it wasn't difficult. Although in Estonia, in Tallinn, you had a slightly different dynamic because you've got the influence of the Nazis trying to manipulate the remainder of the German ruling class and the German merchant class who are still there, and rather keen for the Nazis to come in. Then you've got the Russians who are worried about this, and then you've got Estonians who are worried about both the Nazis and the Russians. So that was a slightly more complicated situation.
Yeah. So, what made you just decide that you were going to go, like, move on from, well, not move on, but decide that you were going to, like, sort of like detour from, like, Angus and Oban and Scotland?
That's quite simple. I think that it's not a good idea to have just one series and become a one series author. And it was a deliberate decision to write a different book, because I think, what you don't want to get into is the treadmill of, when's the 27th Angus Blue coming out? Is it going to be next week? And, writing more than one series gives you the option, I have to say, of being able to switch them off when you feel you've done enough. And I think if we look at Anne Cleeves, for instance, who stopped the Shetland series when she felt she'd actually done enough with it. So I think it's important. And I'm sure Lesley has got other things up her sleeve as well. So
I'm just thinking you've got 2 series there, Alan, so that'll be 2 TV programmes that they can make about them, like Anne Cleeves. You can have your Shetland and you can have Estonia. And
yeah. They'd both be I think they'd both be equally interesting. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, have we got a problem?
Echo.
See how we get on. Sorry, it's just a bit of an echo here.
That's okay. I'll keep on talking because mention of a TV series, that will be wonderful, because the sort of thing one always does when one is writing is you think, who's going to play Angus Blue and who's going to play so-and-so, and you think, well...
Who have you got in mind?
Well, I think Dougie Henschel or David Tennant would be, but maybe Sam Heughan, it's... one can always
shoot for the stars.
Absolutely. So that's always a nice game to play, is to think, and that slightly helps you because you can then enable you to picture the characters better. And I'm sure, Lesley, you do the same with Mona and Bernard and so on. And
absolutely, but I've got questions. Getting a terrible echo, but
are you? Oh dear.
Am I echoing for you or just for me?
No, you're fine for us. Fine for
all right,
me, anyway.
We'll keep going then. I've been meaning to read your books for ages. Because we have strong family connections to Isla. My husband grew up on Isla until he was 9, because his dad was a woodwork teacher at the local high school. So they were kind of key workers and lived there. So we've been there loads with kind of extended family. My husband had a question for you, though, because you've set a book on Isla, a book on Jura. So he wants to know if Colonsay is going to be the next one. Could you make a murder on Colonsay?
I could certainly do, because that's where my family comes from. My father's family comes from Colonsay. My grandmother was from Jura. So I could do that. I've decided to make we haven't been to Colonsay for a few years. I did go. We did go several times when our children were younger, and went through all the graveyards and the sort of thing you do to find your ancestors. But I could come back to Colonsay, but I'd need to visit the place first. So the next one is actually set in Appin, because Angus Blue is based in Oban, so that seemed, and Appin's a place we go to quite often, so that seemed the obvious place to put one. And if you know Appin, there's an interesting scene where, I don't know if you know the Jubilee Bridge near Port Macreish, but there's an interesting scene there where a body is found. But anyway.
I very much look forward to the Isla and Jura books and getting into those.
Oh, good. Have you been to Isla or Jura? Lesley?
Yeah, been there loads. Probably about 8 or 9 times. Just a couple of times to Jura. We've always stayed on Isla on the mainland. But we stayed in Port Charlotte mainly the last few times we went over. But it's a really interesting island, I think, with the mixture of people who've lived there forever and the sort of incomers around whiskey and things.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It is an interesting place. And in fact, that's what stimulated the Peak Dead. Was, I don't know if you went to the airport, but just outside the airport, across the main road, is what's left of the air base. The airport, current Isla Airport, used to be a very large air base during the Second World War, and there are still some of the buildings and the floors of the buildings across the road from the current airport. And it was looking at those and walking through them that kind of stimulated me to write the story in the first place. So, yeah, all sorts of interesting places. And particularly distilleries, because obviously whiskey does play a part in the stories, and I had to do a lot of research to get the whiskies just right.
Absolutely.
Even for the second one, you know, I just happened to have with me here a bottle of Jura whiskey, which will. I've almost drunk it, unfortunately.
For research purposes.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So, you know, Angus Blue does like a nice glass of whiskey. So there you go.
I think I'm going to ask when each author isn't speaking that they put their thing on mute just so that it stops the echo.
Ah, okay.
This one
Full
is
stop. No. I've got a problem there because when I mute this microphone, the computer's microphone takes over. So I'll just be very quiet if that's okay.
So, Lesley.
I'll unmute. See what happens.
Oh, I don't know why it's doing. Usually, let's see. We were fine.
I'm not getting any echoes here. Lesley, are you getting any echoes?
Yeah, actually, not at the moment. Oh no, I am getting an echo. I have a time delay, but I'm getting an echo.
Right. Well, let's talk about your pandemic novels then, Lesley.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed, because you read them and then you think, looking at what's happening now, I think, now why didn't she give them masks back then?
I do. Gosh, this echo is really distracting. I hope people can hear this, but I do have some people wearing masks, but it's not been made mandatory in my books. Yeah.
In the next one, presumably it will be.
Well, that's a very good question about how I write the next one.
Yeah.
Because obviously the first 4 books in the series I was writing, and you know, it was a fantasy world. I could make it up and say whatever I wanted, really. But now I suppose I feel a bit kind of hamstrung if I'm writing another book. You know, what exactly do I say? Because in my books, for example, there's not been a vaccine. So do I continue with that? Having a world where nobody's been vaccinated? Or is that going to really annoy readers? Are they going to think, well, why doesn't she just have a vaccine? We have a vaccine now. But I did get quite a lot of it right. And I don't know, we've still got a bit of time. So what I've done is I've pulled out some quotes from the book. That this was my views, and you know, a bit like comedy, the secret of writing a good book is timing, and this was timing. Real life caught up with me. But this was what I said about virus policy in the books. That virus policy was educated guesswork, a series of decisions based loosely on research and tempered by the level of restrictions on their liberty that the electorate would tolerate. So that was virus policy. In terms of hoarding, remember in the early days of the pandemic, there was lots of hoarding going on. It's a quote from the first book. Bernard gaped at the tinned goods that were stacked from floor to ceiling across the room. He didn't pay much attention to our advice about not hoarding foods, did he? And then
the corpses in the next room, yes.
Yeah, the corpse in the next room. And this is a bit with a mask in it. There was one of the things that really made me laugh was that the teenagers that were getting arrested for having raves and things, because one of the big things in the first book is about teenagers having a rave. So this is from the first book. A girl with pigtails danced past her wearing a brightly coloured mask over her mouth. Otherwise, the dancers seemed to be ignoring any kind of virus protection. It must be great to be 20 and think you're immortal. So definitely seeing echoes of that. And the last bit that I pulled out from the books was about lockdown itself. This was what people thought about it. It's an incredibly unpopular policy. The government is worried about the loss of productivity. The retailers hate it. Women's charities hate it because they predict a rise in domestic violence. And the police are ambivalent about policing the lockdown. So that was the view in my parallel imaginary worlds about lockdown. But
so that's pretty close. That's pretty good.
I think it was not too bad.
Yeah. So in the next one, you'll have a dodgy virus being created by some people who say, yeah, this virus is 100% effective, but maybe it isn't.
Yeah, so I could focus on that. And I did actually, the vaccine sort of came up as something when I did there's an organisation called the Bad Plugs Book Club. And they only read books that are about infectious diseases. So, it's a great reading list for anybody that's out there and thinking they want pandemic. Oh, I don't know if anybody out there can hear me. I'm seeing little messages flash up. Yeah, nope. I don't have earplugs or anything. There's no other devices in here that will be making this echo. Lindsay, have you got any suggestions?
Putting the microphone out. Yeah.
With the earphones, and it's making no difference. I don't know.
No.
Now, is that better?
Let's see, is that better?
Yes.
Is that better? Yeah.
Is that better for anybody? No, I'm still getting an echo.
Ah.
And am I okay? Yeah. No, I'm not either.
I suspect it's to do with Allan's double.
Well, I've taken one of them. I've pulled one of them out, so I've only got one.
And it's still not. Can you mute yourself now and see if that makes any difference?
Oh, hang on. Let me.
Right, try again. Hooray!
Hello?
Hooray! So that seems to be okay from my end without an echo. Can I just ask if anybody heard anything at all that I said for the past 10 minutes? What do you think, Lindsay? Should I read out the stuff that I just read out again, or did people hear that?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, it's fine to go over. So you were saying that.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Right. Well, we'll assume that you didn't hear it. And what I said was I'd pulled out some of the bits of the book that I thought most closely reflected real life. And the first quote I pulled out was about virus policy. So in the first book talked about virus policy was educated guesswork, a series of decisions loosely based on research and tempered by the level of restrictions on their liberty the electorate would tolerate. Hoarding, we talked about in the first book, Bernard gaped at the tinned goods that were stacked from floor to ceiling across the room. He didn't pay much advice to our not hoarding food, did he? And then I read all about in the papers about the groups of teenagers that were having raves or meetups in parks and things and getting arrested. So predicted all that as well. The first book, a girl with pigtails danced past her, wearing a brightly coloured mask over her mouth. Otherwise, the dancers seemed to be ignoring any kind of virus protection. It must be great to be 20 and think you're immortal. And then the final one was the views of the characters about lockdown. It's an incredibly unpopular policy. The government is worried about the loss of productivity. The retailers hate it. Women's charities hate it because they predict a rise in domestic violence. And the police are ambivalent about policing lockdown. So that was my predictions in my books. Quite a few of them obviously came true. Some things I didn't get at all in terms of hoarding. I didn't really anticipate that anybody would be hoarding toilet roll for the very good reason that it's a respiratory illness as far as I was aware. I didn't have things like the schools closing in my books. And obviously that's been a very controversial area, and there's been lots of pressure to get the schools open and keep them open, generally because of the vulnerability of some children if they're in their homes all the time. But the thing that really I just would never in a million years have predicted is the level of investment that the government has put into things like the furlough payments. I don't think anybody would have thought that kind of money could be made available, particularly as we've had a lot of rhetoric about austerity in the years running up to that. But the money has been found for that. So that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. And Allan and I, in amongst all the echoes, we're talking about, the next book, and do I kind of, use reality in that? Because in my books, there's no vaccine. And if I write another book, is it going to be really annoying for readers? Are they going to just be sitting there thinking, well, there's a vaccine. Why haven't you given them all the vaccine? And that would change things. But, from a plot point of view, having a vaccine is a bit of a cul-de-sac in terms of, plot points, because obviously we're all going to have herd immunity at some point, and then the vaccine will mean, hopefully, that COVID stops being an issue. And that would be the same for my virus and my books. The next book that I did actually have plotted before the COVID hit, it was actually food shortages that I was going to be looking at. And I have to say that was much more influenced at the time by Brexit, because there was, in my work, we were doing a lot of talk about, well, what if food prices go through the roof because of Brexit? What if there's shortages of supplies? So I'd kind of used all that and put that into a kind of, pandemic sort of environment. Although fortunately that's not really been something that we've actually seen happen. But in terms of writing a book about a pandemic, and I know that Allan's got one as well, so I'm very interested what he thinks about this. One of the big issues for me has been about how you market that, because obviously the pandemic is very, very real, and we've seen people dying from it. So my books are they're supposed to be humorous. So I'm not sure how well received a kind of darkly comic look at the virus is going to be. And Allan, I mean, obviously you wrote your book as well. You wrote yours in real time. I mean, mine had all the time in the world because it was written before the pandemic, but you've got one that you've written since. Did you have any concerns about how it might be received?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to discussions with authors where this question has been raised. Do we incorporate the pandemic in our writing, or do we kind of pretend it never happened? A lot of authors felt, well, why, let's just not pay any attention to it. We'll just carry on the Inspector Z series as if it's never happened. For me, that's not quite good enough, because the pandemic, has happened, and it is part of our history. And the normal that we get after the pandemic won't for an awful long time be the sort of normality that we had before. And whereas Lesley's really got a situation where there is I'm assuming it's a global pandemic, and not just restricted to Edinburgh, unless of course it is something to which Edinburgh people are particularly prone. But in my case, it's a much simpler thing. I just tried, this is in the book called A Fatal Contagion. I tried to imagine how a police investigation would carry on under pandemic conditions, and how the the way in which you actually go about tracking down the murderer might be affected by the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So you have interviews which are online. You have people masked and standing apart from each other. There's a scene where one of the police personnel, she needs to interview the people in a tenement block. So she rings the buzzers and shouts up at them, and they lean out the window and talk to her. So it was much more a question of how does normality get adjusted in terms of the lockdown situation. So a very different kind of situation from what Lesley's talking about, which is the total world effect of it. But I mean, I have had people saying that this pandemic isn't going to go away because it's very good at mutating, and once you've got a vaccine that knocks out one, then another one will pop up. And unless I did hear somebody saying, unless the entire world population is vaccinated, we're never going to get over the top of this. But on the other hand, I've also heard people say, well, eventually, like Spanish flu, it will die down. It will become part of the normal flu landscape. So I don't know, but I don't think it'll be a while before we get back to normal. Would you agree with that, Lesley?
Yeah, absolutely. I very much liked your idea of a disease that only affected Edinburgh people. They're not quite sure what that would be, panlophitis or something. But yeah, I definitely think there could be something in that. Yeah, I mean, I think we will get back to normal. One of the people we work with through my day job, I work in the voluntary sector, and somebody from the NHS was very much pains to point out that there's no such thing as a post-COVID world. It's going to just be a COVID world that we live with and manage it in the way that we do manage flu. And the virus in my books was actually based on Spanish flu. I used all the kind of, the symptoms and things and the reaction people would have as if it was Spanish flu. And one of the most interesting things about Spanish flu compared to the illness that we have at the moment is that, COVID has struck very particularly at certain groups of people, and the elderly have been by far the worst affected. With Spanish flu, the way that it worked was it overstimulated your immune system. So the people most likely to die from it were the young, the fit, the healthy. And it came right at the end of World War I. So a lot of these poor young soldiers that had survived, the terrible conditions in the trenches actually succumbed to Spanish flu. So one of my thoughts when I was writing the books originally was, how would people react to an illness that the people that most at risk were like their teenage children? And seeing a pandemic and seeing exactly how distressed everybody's been by it, you think, well, yeah, that would make it even worse. But policing, I think, it's a really interesting, issue about policing, because in some ways the detectiving side of it is the easy bit in a pandemic, because you can put all these kind of measures in place. But the up close and personal stuff with the police, you can't avoid that. And not only are the police putting themselves at risk, that they're having to self-isolate and things, which puts constant pressure on manpower. And the other thing is that, you talk to any policeman for more than 5 minutes, they'll tell you an awful lot of their job nowadays is dealing with mental health issues. And of course, the pandemic, we've seen a huge increase in mental health issues. So I think, that there are some really interesting novels to be written, I think, about policing in a pandemic. But I think, fair play to you for writing one while things are still changing, because I think certainly if you're traditionally published, one of the things, and there's quite a long lead-in time to getting a book out. And that's what I was thinking, if you're trying to write something realistic, well, we don't quite know how the vaccine's going to pan out now. So how do you, write something and think it's still going to be relevant in a year's time when you're published?
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, what gave you the idea of writing about people dying of an illness in the first place?
Well, with my day job, I work in the voluntary sector, but we're kind of, I work for an umbrella body, and we represent the interests of all the charities and voluntary organisations in our area. And we sit in a lot of meetings. Well, we certainly sit in a lot of meetings now, but we used to sit in meetings and discuss emergency planning. So mainly what we planned for was bad weather. was obviously, you know, that's very realistic every year. The Beast from the East, all that, you know, we planned what we would do. But one strand of that planning was thinking about, well, what if there's a pandemic? And I would say that, you know, everybody around the table was thinking flu. They were thinking at some point we're going to get a really, really, you know, virulent flu that's going to knock lots of people out. We're going to have lots of frontline staff off. How are we going to manage that? Nobody had predicted anything like this. Although I suppose if you look at, you know, the Asian countries, they've already had run-ins with SARS and things like that that have been not dissimilar to this. But there were a few sort of things that were making me think I wanted to write about the people that deal with that, because I sometimes feel that characters that appear in books from things like local authorities, council workers, they can be a bit stereotypical. They're always the terrible housing person that's not giving somebody housing or that, whereas it's much more nuanced. And, you know, I thought it'd be really interesting to write about people who are at the sharp end of something like a pandemic, the pressures that they were under. And I also thought it gave an opportunity because they're kind of a hybrid, that half the people in the team come from the NHS backgrounds, half come from the police, you know, to have a bit of a culture clash, because I mean, some of the police in mine are a bit more reactionary than most police would be nowadays. But I thought there was a bit of a culture clash there. And I just really wanted to show the sort of, you know, the nuance of frontline staff in the public sector. And also I thought it gave great opportunity with Bernard, and I love Bernard, and I don't think you could possibly read the book and not fall completely in love with Bernard. He's really in at the deep end. He's been sold this job that's a health job, you know, helping people with that, but really it's the kind of job where you everybody has to go and have a health check every month, and then Bernard and Mona come round and try to find you if you don't turn up for this. And the kind of people that don't turn up for the health check are invariably people that want to punch them when they come round, and poor Bernard's thrown into the midst of all that. So it seemed a bit of an outlandish sort of scenario at the time. That was a bit of feedback I got from one of my friends saying, oh, my book group read it, but somebody was saying, oh, it just seems completely outlandish to me. Bet she's eating her words now that she's seen a pandemic close up. But yeah, that was the main sort of you know, focus, and also trying to write something that hasn't been written, you know, a million times before. I write in Edinburgh because I live in Edinburgh, and that's where I know some big shoes to fill there around sort of, you know, Edinburgh police procedurals, getting into that. And it's actually quite difficult to find somewhere that, you know, either Ian Rankin or Quentin Jardine hasn't already murdered somebody. And that was why with the novel Death at the Plague Museum, I actually had to invent somewhere for the murders to take place. So I got to invent a plague museum. It'd be really interesting to see if you know, that we see a plague museum opening up, because it was great fun kind of thinking what sort of exhibits would be in that, and probably got a few more to add now that we've actually lived through a pandemic.
Now I'm going to ask you something else, and that is that what is nice about the books is that you've restrained yourself from the sort of people dropping dead with black spots all over them and suppurating wounds in the streets, and, you know, zombies approaching, where it all becomes a bit sort of and it is more of a sort of humorous, as you say. I must admit, the character I do like is Maitland, who has a great capacity for making snide remarks about everybody, and that's quite nice. So keeping that, not falling into the trap, if you like, of making it a people dropping dead in the street scenario, kind of actually makes it more realistic. Do you think?
Yeah, I was very keen that there was that realism in it, because I do watch all these programs. Like I watched about 8 series or so of the Walking Dead before it just got so depressing I couldn't take it anymore. But an awful lot of pandemic series, it does seem to be that, you know, within weeks you're reduced that there's only, like, you know, a handful of people left on the earth, and kind of thinking, well, actually, no, that isn't what would happen with a pandemic, because we planned for it, and, you know, it started off, and that it would be something that you would have a certain percentage of people would die, but by no means everybody. But there's lots of sort of, you know, I mean, the very title of the book, The Health of Strangers, it is something, there's a continuing theme in the books about civil liberties and exactly what restrictions you'll put up with on your life if it means that people don't die. which was a bit of a theoretical philosophical discussion when I was writing about it. And now, I mean, it's on the TV every night, those kind of dilemmas. But I never thought that things like masks, I didn't think that would become such a controversial issue. Just thought, you know, if you're asked to wear a mask, you'd wear a mask. What reasons could you come up with for not thinking that that's a good idea? But as we see, you know, as soon as you start restricting people's liberties in any way, it becomes very, very controversial.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's and it is this balance, isn't it, between letting people go about their lives, but at the same time making them stop doing things that will spread the virus. And I must admit, I've seen some computer models of, for instance, what happens when a jogger goes past you who isn't wearing a mask, and you think, oh, you know, that convinced me to wear a mask, or even outside. So yeah, but I think Lindsay was talking about some questions from the audience at about 1:45, which is now.
Yes, I think pretty much covered what's been getting asked. I mean, one of them was from Wendy, and it was how did you find? Well, it was too late. How did you find writing about a pandemic in a pandemic? But I'm also going to let that out to Allan as well, because obviously he wrote fatal congestion in a pandemic, and it covers obviously from a police point of view, but also did you just like generally find it hard to write in a pandemic? Because I know some people have said that they found it easy and they're just like sitting in their desk every day and they're typing out their books and they're getting the next book out and the next book out, and this is all great, and other people have said struggled to like sit down and like actually write. How did you both feel about that?
I mean, the main issue for me about writing was that I didn't find it difficult to write, but I just had absolutely zero time due to the fact that I was working in a job that was affected by the pandemic, and we were incredibly busy, got given loads and loads of volunteers, had loads and loads of new policies and procedures, and were supporting the third sector to navigate all the new funding that was available. So we were incredibly busy. And it's only like now that I'm starting to feel, well, I actually need to get back into this writing. But I was actually writing something else that wasn't about the pandemic, a sort of crime novel that wasn't about the part of the series. The next one was always going to be a standalone, which I think was good because I think it just got so confusing. And even at work, I was kind of thinking things, and then I was thinking, oh no, actually that isn't part of our pandemic policy. That's something that I made up and wrote in a book. So it was getting very confusing. And one of the things in the books I wrote about was every book they end up for some reason or another at the Scottish Parliament's virus committee, the pandemic committee, because that their nemesis runs this, the politician that does it. And then with my job, I got invited to give evidence to the local government committee at the Scottish Parliament, and it did feel a bit, whoa, I'm at the pandemic virus committee that I write about in my book, and you know, real life has come full circle. So yes, I was quite glad that I was writing something else. Yeah. What about you, Allan? This was much more live for you.
There we go. Yeah, in fact, not long after the lockdown started, Ken MacDonald, who's the editor of iScot magazine, and I write a short story every month for iScot magazine, he said, Allan, can you write me a novella, because we want to give it away as a kind of free gift to subscribers. And so I wondered what to write, and then I thought, well, it's got to be an Angus Blue story because that's what he kind of wanted. And what better thing to do than to set it right now, right at the moment of writing, and look at the challenges that he faces when a body is found in a camper van, which shouldn't be there, of course, parked at the front in Oban. So that's where that came about. And it took me about a couple of months to write, and obviously the pandemic was still going on, so that was okay, as it were, in terms of the book. And that was fine, and I got very good feedback from it. And in fact, in the next book, A Murder in Appin, there is still the sort of, because it's kind of set this year, there is a kind of post virus thing where everybody has to keep, distancing. They have to keep wearing masks now and then, and they have to keep watching things out. And the restaurants are all divided up into air-conditioned booths. So I've tried to imagine what a post COVID world would look like without making it too dystopian.
Saw a question flash up on screen there about what we're writing next.
Yeah, sorry,
yeah.
I was just trying to answer it and I didn't realise it's a new feature, you can tap it up. So, oh wait, is it no? So where we go. So, is this from Helen Forbes? She's saying to both authors, "What's next?" Apologies if you've said and we have missed it due to the technical issues. Yeah, we can't have an online book festival without technical issues. We were going so well, we just had to have one. So to both of you, what's connected? I know Lesley, you've always covered it, trying to write all this away from the Health of Strangers, and I think Allan did mention that he was writing obviously the next one, and then I'm assuming that he would continue on. But is there anything else?
Well, if I can just say, the next Angus Blue is set in Appin. I mentioned that already. It's called A Murder in Appin. I'm working on that now. Once that's done, I've got another one in the Yuri Halmet series to write. So whereas the first one is set in 1933, this one is set in the winter of 1935, and that'll be called Winter Blood. So that'll probably come out early next year, I suspect. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Lesley.
Well, I take my responsibilities very seriously now, because obviously everything that I write comes true. So I'm going to steer clear of writing about any vampires or anything like that. But my apologies to people that live in the northeast of Scotland, because the next book that I'm writing is set there, and it's about extreme weather conditions. So, I can only apologise if there's any torrential rain that comes about as a result of this. But I went on holiday a few years ago when my kids were very young to a place called Johnshaven, which is sort of northeast in between Montrose and Stonehaven, that bit of the world. But we went there in the February break, so it was really quite bleak. And when we were there, just after they'd had a quite serious flooding in the villages along the coast there. And of course, as crime writers, you just need to see bleakness and disaster and start thinking, a few bodies around here, and that could make quite a good story. So I'm in the midst of writing that at the moment, writing it quite a bit more slowly than I usually write, just due to everything else that's going on. But it's the first time I've tried a police procedural, and certainly finding the limits of my knowledge with that one and having to ask a lot more questions. Because one of the good things about the Health of Strangers was it was a made-up agency, the health enforcement team. So I could just make all the rules that I wanted to, and it had its own internal logic. But, when you're dealing with the police, you have to sort of get it quite right. I don't know how you do your research for that, Allan.
Yeah, we have a friend who is an ex CID officer who looks through the book and finds errors that I've made, and generally puts me right. And that is often, I think that's somebody you need. You do need an ex-cop who can actually say, no, that doesn't work. We wouldn't do that. For instance, one of the things she picked up at one point, Inspector Blue writes something down in his notebook, tears the page out and puts it in his pocket. And she said, no, you don't do that. You don't take pages out of your police notebook. But then she told me all sorts of stories about what policemen have done with their notebooks to make sure they don't look as if they've been tampered with. Anyway, we won't talk about that. But however, now the police have PDAs. They don't have notebooks. So that's brought in a whole new sort of dimension of policemen tapping away at their keyboards instead of scribbling in their notebooks. So that's having that person just looking through and saying, no, they wouldn't do that, that was really helpful to me.
So I have another question from Wendy Jones. She said, if you could write something other than crime, what would it be?
I kind of like books that are about politics. So, but it's hard to imagine a political thriller that wouldn't have a crime in it. But the other books that I quite like are sort of urban fantasy ones. I'm not into sort of dragons and that kind of fantasy, but I do like the ones that take, is the world's pretty much as it is, but there's magic in it, that kind of thing. So bit of a hankering to write something like that. I think it'd be quite escapist after writing about a pandemic, which is a bit full on. It'd be writing like something like that.
Interestingly, I wouldn't mind writing something further back in history. So maybe it might be, the trouble is the crime would tend to keep creeping in, so if I was writing about, I was thinking about Tacitus, detective, so Tacitus and his mate Suetonius go around solving crimes. I thought that'd be quite a good wee series. So probably something historical.
His
I think you're on mute.
the joys. So we're just going to ask there, what are your feelings on the term tap noir? Because obviously I know that a lot of Scottish crime authors don't like that term anymore because they just feel it's kind of too nichey, too like puts them into a box that they don't really feel that they fit into. Well, obviously I know that Lesley writes her books are thrillers. They're not really like crime, and obviously Allan crime. But obviously, you know, it does. So, what's your feelings on that kind of?
Well, if I can take that first, I think they're right. Actually, I think the term tarte noir had some meaning at the beginning when people were following McIlvanney, people like Ian Rankin and so on. But I think the fact that so many people have now come into it, that it's becoming increasingly similar to, or rather, I should say, other places have started writing very similar things. And since we've got Nordic noir and so on, I think that the term noir has now kind of got worldwide, and it's now time, I think, to start looking at the genres within the crime, so that you've got, the historical crime, the cozy crime, the animal crime. You have dog detectives now, cat detectives, historical detectives, amusing detectives, grim detectives, psychological detectives, forensic detectives. So all of these subgenres, I think, are now starting to define crime writing much more than the notion of where it's come from. Lesley.
Yeah, a bit like Allan. Exactly. When you hear tarte noir, I think William McIlvanney and that kind of really hard-boiled stuff, which doesn't really describe my books. I mean, it's a marketing thing like anything else, and if it works, I'm not going to disagree with being marketed in that way. It's quite nice to be marketed as Scottish, I think, definitely. But I'm wondering if we have enough now for a pandemic noir, or are there enough of us out there that have written about, pandemics that we could all be grouped together? I think it's really interesting, actually, that you go into a bookshop and there are no tables set aside for pandemics. And I think that's a kind of measure of how the general public feels about it. So, but maybe when we're all vaccinated, we can revisit this and there'll be people interested in writing about what happened then, or what could have happened. My virus was better, definitely, better than real life.
I've just got a joking
I
question.
was just going to suggest that a really interesting book, sorry, Lesley, a really interesting book would be a collection of short stories by different authors, all with a pandemic theme. That would be quite a good wee collection.
There you go. That's your next. There you go. We'll start. Lesley and Allan can start a pandemic short story collection. I've just got a little joking question for Lesley. She's saying, don't think it's coming up. Why? If they were to be vampires, Lesley, where exactly would they be? Asking for a friend, shocked face.
Well, I think we could go full circle back to our earlier discussions about illnesses that only affected Edinburgh people. So maybe we could have vampires that were picking off, and this could bring in my urban fantasy stuff as well here. We could have, they were hanging around the sort of railway tunnels of Edinburgh, picking off unsuspecting people with cut glass accents from Edinburgh and a genuine friendliness to the world. So they probably had it coming. Nobody would miss them.
I would suggest.
Some locals would probably say.
Sorry, I was going to suggest that a kind of genealogical gene thing, whereas the vampires only pick up on people who've got a Romanian gene or a particular gene. So you have these doctors who are desperately trying to work out who's got this gene before the vampires get to them. That might be quite a good one.
I think you started something here, Jackie. I think this is a book that we all need to get together and write between us.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got a short story, pandemic short story, and we've got a vampire series. There you go. No, I was just going to say, some local people in Edinburgh would actually probably say they see vampires wandering about aimlessly at all hours in the morning in Edinburgh. Anyway, or you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to leave. Like the airport. You can see a lot of people looking like they've just crawling around like zombies and vampires. So maybe it's not an unusual thing. I love Edinburgh. I live on the east coast, so I do love Edinburgh. But sometimes you're like, whoa, they must have had some because she's saying fab. Oh, good idea. I'm in. The project we'll do a little short story collection. You heard it first. Has anybody else got any questions about Lesley Allan over here? Just waiting for them to come in. I might just ask, what gave you the initial idea, Lesley, to go from the house in Trinity, which was a standalone, to then deciding? Obviously, you said about you working for the council. Obviously, you knew that kind of, like the procedures and stuff. But what was the initial spark? Because you could have obviously just stayed on writing standalones, kind of in that genre, like in Edinburgh. But what was the initial spark to start the Health of Strangers?
Well, after Fine House and Trinity came out, I met my editor and just did a bit of a kind of brainstorm about what the next book could be. I mean, it could have been another book. We left a few loose ends in Fine House and Trinity that could have, followed that up. But then I pitched them this idea about a series about a pandemic, and they were quite taken with that. So that was, why we went down that route. But I suppose that both my first book was written, I live in Trinity, so it was written, looking out the window at the big houses around here, and imagining, a dead body being found in one of them. So like all authors, I just kind of, mind my real life for inspiration. So one inspiration came from where I lived, and then the next one came from where I worked. So I suppose that was why, really.
Same question to Allan, but also not the pandemic. The books, but what made you decide? Obviously you had Angus, and he was Melbourne, and you wanted to obviously like branch out. But why did you choose Estonia? And why did you choose the decade of the 1930s?
Oh, simply because we visit Estonia a lot. We know the place as much as visitors can, and we've tried to get around and to learn the history. I used to be a history teacher, so it was the obvious place to go for next to Isla. And the other thing is that I do want to include a political dimension, and all of my novels have a political dimension in them, because in many ways the crimes that go unpunished are the crimes in the political sphere. That are covered up or whatever, and I do want to get that dimension into it, the interference that comes from the political sphere into the work of justice and the police. So I wanted to have that same dimension, but implemented in the way it would work in Estonia as opposed to in Scotland. So it was trying to get those two elements in.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much to Lesley and Allan, and also to everybody for hanging around with technical issues. I knew it was going to pop up. You can't have an online book festival without technical issues. Just to let you all know that the next and the last panel of the festival this weekend is at 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and it's called Glasgow No Mean City, and it's featuring MG Newman, Jackie McLean, who's on as a viewer tonight, and Carol Ramsey as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So stay tuned for that one. And just gonna thank you so much again for to Lesley and to Allan for coming on. It's been lovely speaking with you guys. I'm just gonna end the broadcast now. Oh, here we go.